If the Atlantic Liberal MPs do not vote for Atlantic Canadians in the House of Commons, then Atlantic Canadians will not vote for Liberals at election time.
Welcome back to Another Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. Today was the vote for the Conservatives' motion to axe the carbon tax. As expected, the motion was defeated in the House, but there was one very significant surprise.
Let's get into it.
Today, with 1.5 million people relying on food banks, 7 million people having cut their diets below what they should be eating because they cannot afford the price of food. This is the misery that has unfolded after 8 years of this Prime Minister's inflationary deficits and carbon taxes. But it's worse. Now the Prime Minister, with the necessary help of the NDP, plans to quadruple the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre. When you tax the gas and diesel of the farmer who makes the food and the trucker who ships the food, you tax all who buy the food. No wonder people cannot afford groceries. The NDP Liberal government is taxing those groceries and now terrifyingly plans to quadruple that tax. Now, amazingly, members of the Atlantic Caucus of the Liberal Party are now saying the opposite in their ridings than they're doing on Parliament Hill. They have voted 23 times to hike the carbon tax when they're here. But then when they go back to Atlantic Canada, they say they're against the carbon tax. So, Madam Speaker, the people of Atlantic Canada are smarter than that. They're not going to be fooled by politicians who say one thing in the Atlantic and say the exact opposite when they are on Parliament Hill. They will realize this is a very simple principle. If the Atlantic Liberal MPs do not vote for Atlantic Canadians in the House of Commons, then Atlantic Canadians will not vote for Liberals at election time.
So this was on Thursday, September the 28th of this year. The Conservatives tabled a motion that would call for the government to introduce legislation within 7 days of the motion being adopted to repeal all carbon taxes across Canada. Although there are reports of many Atlantic MPs calling on Trudeau to repeal or at minimum provide an exemption on the carbon taxes, only 2 have been public about it. The first one is MP Ken McDonald. This is an excerpt from a CBC article recently. It reads, Atlantic Liberal MPs say they want an additional rural carve-out on the carbon tax to ease cost of living pressures specific to Canadians living outside major urban centres. MP Ken McDonald, who represents the riding of Avalon in Newfoundland and Labrador, said many of his constituents feel abandoned by the federal government. He brought their concerns to the attention of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during the National Liberal Caucus meetings this week in London, Ontario. Quote, I told him exactly as it is, end quote, McDonald said. Quote, we're punishing the rural areas of our country and the most vulnerable people in our society, end quote. McDonald is pushing for a special policy for rural Canadians that would include carbon tax rebates higher than those from the backstop program currently offers.
The second MP is Cody Bloy from the same article. There should be a higher rural rebate, said Bloy, who represents the Nova Scotia riding of Kings Hants. The policy is the right intent, but I think we need to have some adjustments. So, these are 2 of the many MPs from the Atlantic Caucus that have been trying to get Trudeau and the Liberal government to ease the carbon taxes out in Eastern Canada. We saw in a previous video that we did with Chrystia Freeland where she was completely out of touch with the lifestyle and the way of life of Atlantic Canadians.
Well, and their sources of income, which during the summer months is primarily tourism.
Tourism and fishing and farming, like they're constantly using gas and diesel all the time. And it's not because they do it for fun. They do it to survive.
And to feed the rest of us.
So why would you not be giving them an exemption? They have no choice. So, yeah, it makes sense that they should have an exemption, if not a complete repealment of the carbon tax out east. They're struggling out there. They're crying to their MPs saying, do something. So their MPs are telling them, yeah, we agree with you. We agree with you. And as we said on our latest video, this is a gauntlet. This is a line to draw in the sand for the Liberal MPs and their constituents. It's to see who's going to cross that line and who's going to abandon their constituents. So what ended up happening? Let's take a look.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Poilievre relating to the business of supply. Call in the members.
So what they're doing now is they are making sure that all the MPs are present for the vote. Some MPs are remote, some are still in the building, and they want to make sure that everyone is present so they can count every single vote for every MP in the parties.
La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows. Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Paulus, moved that, given that A, the Bloc Québécois supported the so-called clean fuel standard, a second national carbon tax, which will raise prices on gas in Quebec by 17 cents per litre, according to the parliamentary budget officer, and B, the Bloc Québécois said carbon taxes need to be increased much more radically than it is now. C, the New Democratic Party and Liberals supported measures to quadruple the carbon tax to 61 cents per litre.
D.
D. Atlantic Liberal members of Parliament allege they are not in favour of the carbon taxes, but have supported carbon tax measures 23 times since 2015. The House call on the government to introduce legislation within 7 days of this motion being adopted to repeal all carbon taxes to bring home lower prices on gas, groceries, and home heating.
La période de...
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
Que tous ceux qui appuient la motion...
All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale. Mr. Ellis. Mr. Kimmett.
Mr. Kimmett.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upon.
Ms. Landsman.
Ms. Landsman.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Halland.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Barlow.
Barlow.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
So you
Mr.
notice that
Vidal.
not all the
Mr.
Conservatives are
Lewis
rising.
Essex.
It's because they count row
Mr.
by
Seaback.
row.
Mr.
So
Small.
everyone stands
Mr.
who is
Bazan.
going to be
Mr.
voting in
Stewart.
favor of the motion,
Mr.
and
Duncan
then
Stormont Dundas,
the
Glengarry.
roll caller will call their name to acknowledge that they've
Bertels.
received their vote, and then
Mr.
they will sit.
Workington.
Workington.
Ms. Finley.
Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Abouteif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ferrari.
Mr. Holback.
Mr. Holback.
Mr. Richards.
Richards.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Aitchison.
Aitchison.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Bien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Williams.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Ms. Cladu.
Ledoux.
Mr. Chambers.
Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Zimmer.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Stanley.
Mr. Calkins.
Hawkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morantz.
Moran.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford's Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Curry.
Mr. Patzer.
Patzer.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Dreeshen,
Mr. Dreeshen.
Ms. Rumpel Garner,
Rumpel Garner.
Mr. Cram, Mr. Tolmie,
Coleman.
Mrs. Wagenthal,
Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp,
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon,
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison,
Mr. Allison.
Mrs. Gallant,
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. McLean,
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley,
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire,
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed,
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields,
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher,
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts, Mr. Williamson,
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold,
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle,
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus,
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey,
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber,
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Lake,
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson,
Mr. Pearson.
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast,
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Khanna,
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Leslie,
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar,
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Vong,
Mr. Bong.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Liberals are not happy.
This is extremely significant. So what just happened was they counted all the Conservative votes and all of them stood up and had their vote counted. And then the independent Kevin Guang, he stood for his vote as well. And then the Liberal Ken McDonald also stood for his vote in favor of the motion. This is huge.
This is huge.
Astronomical.
Because
If Ken is your MP, please send him an email and tell him thank you for standing up for me and other Canadians, because this is so significant. It cannot be overstated.
this is the first crack in the Liberal caucus, everybody. Right here, right now, today. The caucus and Trudeau's hold on the party has a huge crack in it. All it takes is one person to stand up, to have the courage to stand up and say, I'm not doing this anymore for an ideology. I'm not doing this anymore for a party. I'm doing this for my constituents.
And that is exactly what Mr. McDonald did. He has been hearing from his constituents, and he has been vocal in the media, as we read previously, that the carbon tax is detrimental to his constituents. And instead of towing the party line, he stood up with the opposition and said, enough is enough.
Yeah, and you saw all the Liberals turn around like, what? Somebody on our side voted?
And that's why the Conservatives were clapping, because they know that this carbon tax is bad for Canada. But they also know that But they also know that the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc have been sticking together like glue on this issue. And now Mr. McDonald has stood up to say, no more carbon tax.
So you have this guy who's been asking for exemptions. Exemptions is one thing. That means that, the carbon tax is still in place, but there are certain areas where maybe there's a discount, or maybe there's, it's taken away completely. So he voted with the Conservatives to remove every single carbon tax in Canada. So he literally completely broke from the party line on carbon taxes, which has been a huge issue discussed every single day for the last couple of years.
Not only that, but voting in this manner could have repercussions for Mr. McDonald.
Yep.
In Canada, you're not, quote unquote, supposed to vote against your party's wishes. I don't really know why it's that way in Canada. I've been trying to do a little reading, and it says it's been that way since the 50s, roughly. But you are not supposed to vote against your party. You're supposed to have party unity. And again, I cannot overstate how significant this is, because they could punish Ken essentially for voting for his constituents instead of voting for what the party wanted.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of political courage to do that. It really does. He's he's not really going to be talked to a lot at some of the party meetings, I can tell you that.
And again, this is very significant. So if you are one of Ken's constituents, or maybe even if you're not, send him an email and just say thank you. We did, because we know that this took a lot of courage and there may be repercussions for Ken down the line. So we wanted to say thank you for standing up for Canadians.
And why? Why should you send him an email even if you're not his constituent? Because it lets him know, and it lets him talk with his other buddies out in Atlantic Canada, that the vast majority of Canadians don't want this. Look at all of the letters I've received from all over Canada, everybody. Canadians don't want this. It gives him positive reinforcement. And maybe just enough reinforcement to cross the aisle and join the Conservative Party. You never know. The first crack has broken, everybody. Hopefully the rest of the wall will fall.